Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by and welcome to part 2 of the mixed bag of all sorts. So I'll pick up where I left off last time. Now, this Epidendrum nocturnum has grown well. Bug damage followed by what I now know is secondary infections. That's where you get the pitting. So when that was a tiny little new embryo growth, it had some bugs on it that bit holes, and then the holes can easily become infected. Once they dry off like this, yeah, that's it. The infection is effectively gone unless you've got, unless you keep your plants damp, in which case it could get going again. But lovely new cane on this one, pushing on, still growing. Good new root systems, and we have a bud at long last. So that's going to be another first time bloomer. That spike's been sitting there doing nothing for ages, and now it's decided it is going to actually bloom. It could still blast, you never know, but it's looking good at the moment. And according to words that I've read, this is supposed to have a single bloom. Well, that looks remarkably like two to me. Anyway, if it does bloom, it'll be a first timer. I'll be very interested to see what that's like, because I would have bought that plant because of what its blooms were going to look like, even though it was a very young plant, and I've never seen them. So there's no substitute for seeing the blooms for real, and then I can make the decision on whether I really want to keep the plant. But until I see the blooms and smell the fragrance, if there is any, it's just pictures. It's not the same as having it to look at properly and stick your nose in and all that sort of thing, and see if they sparkle in the bright light, and all those sort of things. You've got to have the bloom, really. You've got to see it for real. Pictures often don't do justice, and play with colours as well. Especially my camera plays with reds, something wicked. Turns reds into orange or pink. Still, that's what I've got. Killed two birds with one stone here. Yes, this is a dendrobium. This is moniliform variegata. Has the variegated leaves. Apart from that, it's moniliform. But as a plant, it's a continuous grower, and it is actively maturing 3 canes at the moment. It's coming on quite nicely from what was a failing plant. So it's coming on, pushing out some new roots in places. Not a lot, but some. Yeah. But there's something growing on that cane, and there's something growing on that cane. Now this plant for me has produced kikis, yeah? So I don't ever hold my hopes out on a dendrobium that can produce kikis and has done. I wait and see. Yeah, it's as simple as that. Because until they progress a bit further, you never quite know whether it's going to be blooms or a kiki. But if it's going to be a kiki, it will start to look quite different. If it's going to be buds, it will form a stem with buds on the end. So it's just a wait and see. But yeah, we may have some blooms on that. And I must remember this time to take a picture. Because although I've had this plant bloom for me several times, every single time I've failed to take a still. So I can never do a pop-up of what the blooms look like. I haven't got a picture. Duh. I'll remember this time. Unless they're kikis, of course, in which case I won't. Now, up in amongst this sea of cattleya leaves and stuff, it's not all cattleyas up here, but mainly. There's a few odds and other things in amongst these. But there are sheaths in lots of places, but they're blind sheaths at the moment. Until I see those magic shadows starting to push up from the base of the sheath, there isn't really anything to say, because they could just stay as they are and never bloom, so I always wait. But my Laelia anceps, hang on, where's the camera? I'm on tiptoe again. This is starting to shape at the tip, so that's soon going to start producing buds. That spike is what? About 15 inches long so far, and it's got 2 spikes. The other one's doing the same over here. Yeah, so it's starting to shape the look that's going to start the buds forming soon, and boy am I looking forward to that. And as with the moniliform, that has bloomed for me before and I forgot to take a picture, and quite honestly it is one of my favourite blooms, and I was over the moon when it bloomed last time. So much so I forgot to take a picture. I'll get it this time. I think it had 3 blooms on the spike last time, so we'll see what it does this time. I'll be happy with 1. They're just good. Love it. Now it should be becoming obvious by now. Yes, that's a mounted plant. Yes. Also, it's not a dendrobium, it's a brassica. Yeah? What's it doing at the moment? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's chucking up an enormous, strong new growth with associated new roots pushing out the bottom, and more to come looking at those stumps. That shoot will bloom. Now, if it blooms in the middle of the winter, it might not be a good spike, but we'll wait and see. It's certainly a strong growth. So what am I going to do with that? Water and feed. No question. Simples. Now that's a surprise. That's Miltonidium melissobreani. And strictly speaking, according to my notes, those blooms should have gone over a while ago, and yet they're not. They're not even showing signs of going over yet. That's lasted a hell of a long time. And I'll certainly have that while it's going. It's stunning. While I'm over in this section, we have a sherry baby spike pushing on. Not branched yet, but I'm sure that thing's growing about 1 inch a day. It seems to get, every time I look round, it's like it sneaks up on you. You know, you turn away, go out and have a coffee, come back, and I'm sure it's longer. 2 Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums coming into spike at the moment. One of them is named. This one is Thai Angel, and that hasn't bloomed probably for 2 years, maybe 3. So I'm looking forward to that. And this is a no ID, just Phalaenopsis type dendrobium. That's not a brilliant spike for that type of plant, but all of my Phalaenopsis types were failing. So to actually get new growth pushing on and a spike, 2 spikes, I'm happy. Yeah, they've recovered reasonably well. And that nice bright sunshine we had an hour ago is now raining. Oh, this weather. So there goes my heat, there goes my bright light. And the garden doesn't need watering. Getting all my bonsai soaking wet. Anyway, we've got spikes coming on those. At least 1, maybe 2 of my Phalaenopsis types, well, they can't both be because they're different, but one of them is polar fire, if it's not one of the ones I've lost, because I've got 6 in my notes and I've got 4 plants, so 2 have gone. Now, one of them was named as polar fire, but I've lost the tag, and I have another one with blooms that are incredibly similar, but they're different sized blooms, same colouring, but one of them's got more purple on it and one's got less. One's larger and one's smaller, but until they bloom I don't know which one's which, but we'll find out what that one is in the not too distant future. And one of the ones I've got is white. That was in bloom back earlier in the year, but like an idiot I still didn't put a tag on it. Duh. Got no excuse. I know, Rose, I'll get round to it. The tags will be done as and when. Now they say patience is a virtue with deciding on the spike or growth thing, but it can also be a disappointment. This is my Bifrenaria. It's never bloomed, and it was doing that. Well, you only need to look at the top now. It's a growth. Yeah. The fact that it was pushing out new roots directly at the base, it was reasonably obvious it was going to be a growth, but you live in hope sometimes. Now, new information on this one. This is supposed to dry and rest a bit in the winter, to the extent that the pseudobulbs can shrivel quite badly, as an expectation rather than a worry, if you see what I mean. So I'm keeping this one drier through the winter, and it also needs brighter light than I've been given in it. So maybe by drying it off a bit this winter and getting it better light throughout this winter, even though I didn't get it in the summer, I've been keeping this one quite shaded, all wrong. Maybe the previous 2 mature growths, one each end, may actually spike. I may have to wait now, because I've been treating it wrong. I might have to wait for that new growth to mature before it will actually bloom. but I have to wait and see. So to keep this one hydrated, it's just a matter of, instead of pouring water over the whole thing, plant, bark, the whole lot, I can just water those aerial roots. Just give them a trickle. Yeah, just to stop it going too dehydrated. And we'll see what that does. But it has got actively growing roots. So I don't want it to, you know, stop growing completely, but I do want to try it having a bit of a rest, and we'll see how it goes. But that's not a spike, it's a new growth. So where's the one the other end then? Come on! This one's always grown in pairs. Now this is Dendrobium findleyanum. This is a true winter rest type, yeah? And even though I rested it last year the best I could, it didn't work. I still got no blooms. So we'll see what happens this winter, see what happens when it comes out the other end. But this had a really poor root system on it back in the year. And so what I did was I actually put some moss around it to try and encourage some root growth. Well, I have now got root growth and some pretty good roots attached to the mount. Well, how the hell am I going to water that with all that moss on there without getting it too wet? So the moss needs to come off. And it was deliberately wrapped around the outside of the plant. So all I've got to do is snip a few of the ties and that moss will just fall off, leaving attached roots on the bark, which are then easier to manage. It's much easier to water a mount when you're only dealing with the roots, because you can just sort of gently water. If I water that, the moss is going to get soaking wet, you know, and then that's not really drying it off very well, is it? If it's, you know, if I put water on that moss, it'll be wringing wet, dripping all over the place. So I think I'll put that to one side and get that moss off today. And then we've just got a mount with some nice new roots to deal with. But that was not hydrating back in the summer. It needed some help. And the help seems to have worked. So now we can get back to where we were before. Come on, Roger, concentrate. Decision based on every single new cane has its terminal leaf. So it's stopped growing. Now there are a couple of tiny little new growths down the base here. And there's even a new shoot here. Well, tough. Yeah, I need to concentrate on the mature canes and try and get this one to bloom. It's a vigorous plant, quite honestly. It's pushed good canes out this year, as it did last year. Sacrificing a couple of the newer growths, because they'll stall. If I slow this one right down, those new growths will stall. But then it will push new ones out next year. It's quite a strong plant, so I'm not going to worry if I lose these couple of tiny little new growths. They started incredibly late in the year. And I mean, they have got tiny little leaves. Even if they don't grow, they'll at least produce a tiny little bit of photosynthesis. So yeah, moss off, finish growing for the year. Quite an easy decision on that one. It is a proper resting type, so it needs to stay dry for a lot longer in between waterings. It doesn't need a soak when it gets watered, and it certainly doesn't need any more feed. Yeah, so quite an easy decision on that one. Now, as dendrobiums go, there's always an exception, isn't there? And this is my exception. Now, I've got a feeling I grow this differently to some others. Not a huge amount of people have got Dendrobium hergoglossum, but I think this one's just adopted a pattern that works for me. I get good blooming on this, so I'm not worried about blooms. But if you had this plant and you decided today, let's have a look and see what to do with this one for the winter. These are new growths up the top. Are they still growing? Yep, every single one of them. These are some of the older canes down here. Are they still growing? Yep. Even some of these. Yeah, these are last year's new growths. They're still growing. They haven't reached terminal leaves. It's growing. So, this one doesn't get rested. Not for me. Yeah, gets its feed cut down, but not stopped. And it still gets watered on a reasonably regular basis. Look at the number of canes that are growing on it. They'll just stop If I try resting that, they'll stop. And then they won't extend as far as they could do, and they won't be as long. If they're not as long, I won't get as many blooms. So for me, this one's a simple one. I wish all my dendrobiums were this easy. It just keeps growing. Yeah. So if it keeps growing, I'll keep pushing it, and we'll see what it blooms like next year. So far, each year it's done incredibly well. The plant's getting bigger and bigger, and therefore the number of blooms are getting more and more, not less. So obviously what I'm doing in my environment for this plant is working well. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Now let's catch this one before I forget, because this is just lurking in the background at the moment. This is Maxillaria arachnitiflora, and this bloom's about to open. Not yet, it's got another one following on behind. Failing plant earlier in the year, dealt with, videos on what I did with it and everything like that. And this part of the split is recovering quite nicely. There's quite a few new growths coming on, and from what I can see, the new growths are pushing out clean leaves now. So I think I've solved its problem. And as I say, it's decided to bloom. These blooms are quite large, very spidery, unmaxillaria-like, more bulbophyllum-like in my book. But anyway, coming soon. So for those of you who are relatively new to my channel, you won't have seen the blooms on this earlier, very early in the year actually. It was sort of quite early spring. And it had about 7 or 8 at once and a succession. So it did bloom well at that time and then decided to just rocket downhill. But I've dealt with its problem, and it's coming on again now. I was under the impression that this was an early spring bloomer, but maybe it can bloom any time, as it is now. Looking forward to that opening soon. That won't be far away now. Unusual blooms, and they look like they ought to be fragrant, but they're not. Coming soon. Still on the fence with this Coelogene cristata. What I'm on the fence about is this. My cristatas, I've got 2 of them now, and I've got 2 potfuls basically that have come on well this year, nice big fat bulbs and everything. But I've never got it to bloom before. And in the main, these are late winter bloomers, not sort of autumn, early winter bloomers. But if that is going to be a spike, and where I'm on the fence, I was 50-50 between spike and new growth. I think I'm about 70-30 now that it is a spike, because it doesn't look like any of the new growths I've had. It does look like a spike. That's going to be a wahoo moment when that opens. That is a large white Coelogene with a lovely yellow centre. So hopefully it's going to develop, and that will be my first cristata bloom if it is. It looks like it's the only spike, but it may be that the other plant in the other pot and the rest of this plant may actually bloom at the more predictable time, late winter. Yeah. And this is a strange one, because if you look up the care for Coelogene cristata, you will get 2 schools of thought. There is also a third school of thought that explains the other 2. This has quite a wide distribution, and in some places it grows pretty cool and gets pretty dry in the winter. Yeah, and in other places it doesn't get chilled down so much, and it doesn't dry off as much. Yeah, and it looks like the plants have an inherent genetic makeup of one of those 2 schools. And if you've got the one that does need to dry off pretty good in the winter, to the point where the bulbs starting to crease, but don't let it go too far, because if these shrivel down too much, they will not plump up again. It's one of those balancing acts again. But if you've got one that's got the generic makeup that it does need to dry off in the winter, and you don't do it, it won't bloom. Whereas if you've got the other one that doesn't get quite so cool and dry off as much, and you dry that one off, you'll shrivel the bulbs and the plant will die. So you've got to... I think I've got the one that shouldn't dry off in the winter. I mean, both the potfuls are off the same original plant. But if that's a bloom, which I'm pretty sure it is now, that's going to be a wahoo moment, definitely. They are large, beautiful blooms. So we'll have to wait and see, as always, but if it is, it's my first cristata blooms coming on soon. Might only have one, you never know. One's better than none, as they say. This little coleogeny has bloomed. Again, a large plant split up into two potfuls. Some blooms on both potfuls, but you can see what's really required here. You know, you've got the bits of the plant that, you know, I planted, and since then it's pushed on some nice larger new growths. Well, those are the ones that have bloomed. So obviously I need more of those for next year, because this is a genuine autumn bloomer. But Todd was quite taken with these, so he went out and got one. Difficult to show the bloom's delicacy, quite honestly, but you can see a beautiful rich brown colour there with a little splash of yellow, hairy lip, yeah, and then the creamy greenish colour, and quite an attractive shape to the bloom too. Yeah. So I like that. Doesn't have to be big and blousy to be attractive. Yeah. But it's the colour balance. It's just that chocolate brown doesn't appear very often in the orchid world. Hardly at all, in fact. You get a lot of deep maroons and deep purples, but a true chocolate brown. Lovely little thing. And these seem to be lasting a while. I think this one's just going to go, and then this one will follow on. But they've been out a reasonable time, and hopefully both of these plants will really steam off next year and produce loads of new growths, fill the pot up, and hopefully we can get a few more than just 2 blooms next time round. Nonetheless, it bloomed. That's the main thing. And this is my nuisance dendrobium. Should have been an easy thing to look after this year, but it's decided to play games. This is this year's cane down here. You can see it's just starting to do its autumn thing. Because I know how these grow, that's not a panic. That's just a natural progression. Yeah, you grow the cane. Unfortunately, it's still growing. So at one end of the cane, it's decided it's still late summer, autumn. And at the other end of the cane, it's decided it's autumn, going into winter. But I think with the much lower temperatures I'm getting at the moment, that's going to stop growing very, very soon. Very soon. And it may well be that that's its last leaf it's pushing out. And you can see that the leaves do get smaller as it gets towards the end. Now, if it was still in its growing season, the leaves would carry on getting bigger. But they'll stay that size, I suspect, until such point as they drop. So that's the cane that could bloom. It could also bloom on some of the original old canes that were leafless when I got it. Now that I don't know, because I only got it in the spring this year. So that's a wait and see. Don't know. Unfortunately, it's being stupid and pushed out 2 new growths. Because it's a new plant, I don't want to lose these new growths. So although this should have a distinct winter rest, it's only going to, what I'm going to do is split the difference. It's going to get half a rest. So it's going to get the lower temperatures, it's going to get the brighter light, it's going to get that part of it, but I'm not going to leave it dry for long extended periods, because if I do, that cane will stall and that will just stop growing. Now that might not develop properly anyway. We shall see. But it's still growing roots from this latest new growth here, you know. So if I dry this right off, those roots will stall and that will just stop growing. And I'd rather grow that on, albeit slower, and hopefully push it on. If that can stay green and come out the other end of this year still green, that will be one of next year's canes. And hopefully there'll be quite a few more next year. As I say, I've only had this plant since early spring. But this one's easy to look after as far as giving it a little bit of water now and again, because I can keep the water out of this central core here and just pour some over the bark, so that these fresh roots get some hydration. I think this one's migrating round the back. Yes, it's taking over the mount. Good stuff. So Looking after it's not going to be a problem, but as I say, if I put that into a distinct winter rest, I'll lose that cane. Yeah. So halfway house for you, nuisance. And hopefully we'll see some nice Dendrobium anosmum blooms on at least that cane, and maybe some of the older ones that were there when I got it. A wait and see. But like a lot of the long cane dendrobiums, you know, you're looking at late winter, early spring to see signs of buds. You know, so it's just a waiting game, patience and all that. But in the meantime, they don't get total neglect. Well, they don't in my book anyway. So that's that one. Now, Dendrobium harveyanum, I've had this one quite a few years. Unfortunately, it did go downhill a bit this year, but I've got it to recover. That's not the issue. But this one blooms on and off over a very long period of time. And I've never rested this one. I just ease off a bit in the winter when it's not growing as well, or slowly, if at all. But this year, because it started to go down, it was put into a state of recovery. It was taken out of a pot actually and mounted, and as such it's pushed up some nice new canes, yeah, and is now growing a new root system. Well, I've never really rested this one, and I certainly won't be resting it now. I've got to push these canes on, yeah. So even though they will grow a bit slower because of the light levels, I don't want them to stop. You can see they're all in active growth here, new leaves coming out of all of them, and new roots. So I don't want those new roots to fail. I don't want those canes to slow up. So I will just carry on feeding and watering this one. Now, okay, the feed level will be lower because it won't be growing as fast, but it is growing. So it needs some food and it will need hydrating. So we'll keep that one going and see how it pulls on. We've got another nice spike pushing on here. This is Oncidium verrucosum. Well, it was, it's not now, it's called something entirely different. But like I've always said, the plant's name it gets when I get it, the one that's on the tag, is the one I keep in my notes. What I do if I know there's a distinct name change is just put it in brackets in my notes so that I've got both, if you see what I mean. But its original name stays with me. Typical Oncidium shaped blooms when they come out, and this may well branch, although I don't know, it's actually got buds, so it's not going to branch this time. Well, it might shoot out lower down. But it's got a lot of buds, and as Oncidium blooms go, they're large. They're a beautiful golden yellow with almost black at the top of the blooms, so I'm quite looking forward to that. Seeing that again, and I wasn't expecting that to bloom on that growth, so I'm pleased with that. So that's to come down the line a bit. Two of my little pings have got buds. This is the one I've had a while. That's now two, was one, it's now two. So that's going to bloom again, but I know what that bloom's going to look like because that's bloomed quite a few times on and off. But there's another one over here that's going to bloom, one of my new ones. So we'll see what that looks like. This Oncidium twinkle has many spikes and they're all in different stages. The first one's open, you've got quite large buds following on right down to little buds on new spikes. So that's going to be in bloom a long time. Now we may have a conundrum because the plant behind it also has spikes, and here they are. And to me, they don't look like twinkle spikes. I've been under the impression that that was the yellow twinkle, waiting for it to bloom to find out definitely. And I'm still waiting for it to bloom to find out definitely. But lurking in the back of my memory somewhere was a miniature Oncidium that was bought for my daughter. And when all her plants came down, she only took her Phalaenopsis types back. So somewhere that plant's lurking. And that might be it. So it was effectively a miniature dancing lady, not a twinkle. But, you know, it's got 3 or 4 spikes coming on it. So we will find out down the line. Another nice spike coming up the back here. So that's a wait and see again. No tag. Well, the thing is, none of my daughter's plants had tags unless their shop bought tag was still with them. Like the 2 little Paphiopedilums had Burnham's tags in them, so I know what they are. Right, that'll do for today, because instead of talking about the watering, I'd like to actually get on with it. I've lost my heat now. Quick last look at the two Vandas that are out, the big white and the big blues out now. I love those blooms. Now in both cases, those are second spikes for this year. And in both cases, they're not the same colour. The spike on this one earlier in the year was similar sized blooms. I don't think there's much difference in the size of the blooms, but it definitely had distinct purple tinges to the petals and sepals, and that is almost missing this time round, so it's a much paler coloured bloom. That actually applies to the big blue one as well. That was a deeper purple last time round. So there's obviously something, I think, to do with light. Yeah, depending on how intense the light is when the buds are forming and how long the days are, in other words how long that light is there for, can determine the depth of colour. So, oh, what's that? Oh, here's Mr. Fluffy Cat come in. You don't normally come in the daytime. You certainly don't normally come in here, do you? What are you doing there? Fluffy Cat. Right, I just got a whiff of something. It's Peter Comp under my nose. That's the last spike on that one. That's still hanging in there, and it could be that. Both of those are scented, but they're next to each other, and they are similar. So it could be they're joining forces and getting up my nose. Yay! Latoria buds. Slowly swelling. Yeah, slowly but surely. Can I get at the tag? Nope. I'll look it up. But yeah, one of my other Latorias, that'll be a first time bloomer as well. And I'm looking forward to that, because that seems to have quite a bit of colour on the outside of the buds. Well, when the buds open, that'll be on the back of the blooms, as well as whatever's on the inside, which I don't know yet, because it'll be a first timer. So, good stuff, more to come. I think that's about it. I mean, I've been concentrating on the mounts and, you know, spikes and buds and things in this video. That was the idea. What I will say is, obviously there's decisions to make on some of my mounted dendrobiums. There are no decisions to make on the potted ones, because the potted ones are either Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums, hybrids, or they are Latoria types. Those are continuous growers. They're not going to stop in the winter. They'll slow a bit. Yeah, so I just carry on treating them the same, but just not quite as often. So they're relatively easy to look after. And my Nobiles at the moment, well, that one's in bloom and it's pushing buds. Well, if I don't put some stuff in at the bottom of that plant, those buds won't be up to much. So that one's not getting any form of winter rest yet, if at all this year. The other big one down here, being another Nobile type, that's doing autumn at the moment on last year's canes. Basically this year's canes are staying green, but just looking round, it's finished growing for the year. Yeah, it's reached terminal leaf on all of this year's canes, so it's finished growing, and as there are no buds at all on that, I can now slow that one right down. Yeah, it's going to get the cooler temperatures anyway, because it's out here along with everything else. But that one I can slow down. There's no need to carry on feeding that one anymore now. It's finished growing and its older leaves are dropping. And that's on last year's canes rather than this year's. So it's doing autumn at the moment. And then what will be left will be some bare canes with maybe an odd leaf or two, maybe none. And then this year's canes, which is all the rest, and that's all the bright green. Yeah, going round you're looking at here, 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 and here. That's this year's canes. So there's more than enough to produce blooms next year. And quite honestly, by slowing this one right down now, before it gets a chance to form any buds, I should get my mass blooming on that one next year. So a little bit of thinking ahead on that one. If I carry on watering and feeding that one, that may start to bud. And I don't want that one. I want that one held back. So we'll dry that one off and Just keep it ticking over, no shriveling or anything like that. Just keep it going gently. Stop it getting dehydrated and desiccated. So there we are then. That'll do for this one. Thanks for watching. That's a hell of an assortment in one video, so it's got no real subject matter. But mainly it was looking at buds and spikes that get missed out of other videos, and some things in bloom, and some thoughts about, you know, some of the plants that are mounted. I haven't gone over all of them, obviously. While we're on the subjects of mounts, my Vandas won't get watered today because there's no bucket to water them in, and when that bucket comes in it'll be freezing cold. So I need that bucket of water to acclimatise to back up to room temperature again. But I'm still watering these. I do not want these roots to close over. So they still get dunked in the bucket, and at the moment that's every other day. You know? If we get 3 consecutive cold days with no sun, I might go to 3 days, but I'm not. I went down to weekly last year, and a lot of the roots just stopped growing, and I had to get them going again once the better weather came. So this year I'm not going to let them stop. Just keep them going. Just not let them soak for quite so long. You know, there's not as much growing time during the day, so you know they won't need as much hydration. But if the leaves are going to carry on pushing out the top, and the roots are not going to close over, they still need to be hydrated. So that's what I'll be doing with those. Okay, so see you next time. This has probably ended up being a long one, but most people seem to like them. Those that don't can bail out halfway through. Perhaps come back later. Right, see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.